Cool. Right, we're on. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for agreeing to talk to me.
No, okay.
I did put up quite an extensive blog post about genocide, where I put the links to the films, which we can kind of talk about in a general term as well, and a little bit about what it is that you do with remembering Srebrenica, East Midlands, and stuff like that. So, and also the research group. But I think probably thinking about where to start our conversations, sort of informed by the general conversation I've had over the newsroom, is very much around what is it about your visits to Srebrenica in particular, because I know you've been to Auschwitz and stuff, but remembering Srebrenica that compelled you to come back and want to do something more beyond what you were already doing from, say, a research point of view, or with the course. Stepping up to be the chair of a brand new remembering Srebrenica East Midlands board is no small undertaking, and I know for a fact that you're not sitting around with nothing to do. So what is it about the experience of going that it made you feel that you could do so much more when you returned?
Well, I suppose, like you were saying about the research component, it started off for me around research. So my work going to Auschwitz started off me looking at how do we teach about genocide, and what does that actually mean? What does it do to us? So is it what we call transformative education? So does it actually transform us emotionally, but also in the way we respond when we come home? And I found at Auschwitz that we weren't seeing that. So they'd have an emotional, our students, for instance, would have an emotional experience while they were there, but then do nothing on their return. They didn't know what to do, didn't feel confident, didn't feel skilled enough. So I kind of came from that perspective, really, and then was invited, because of my work around hate crime, to go out as a community champion to Bosnia. The idea of being a community champion is that you pledge to do something on your return. And then you have, so the government fund, Remembering Srebrenica, says you have a funded trip. And I didn't know what to expect. I didn't really know that much about Bosnia. But you arrive, and I think the first thing that hits you is it's a beautiful country. And you can't imagine that genocide happened, within my lifetime. Actually, the year I got married. So that for me was really quite shocking, that there was that personal connection instantly to the history of it. But I think the key thing really was you go to Bosnia and you meet survivors. And I think that for me was a huge issue in terms of, it moved me to want to do something. So you asked, why did I want to do something on my return? Because I saw their resilience, their strength, their courage, the experiences they'd been through. And, after the Holocaust, we said, never again. After Cambodia, we said, never again. We say never again quite a lot. And yet, it's still happening. And so for me, it was about, I'm privileged to be an academic. I have, a captive audience, not that my students would want me to call them that, but they are a captive audience. And I can do things here. And so it started off really about talking to my students and engaging that way, and supporting. So I went with the London and South East Board when I went on my visit to Bosnia. And so I ended up supporting some of their events. And I think commitment to that meant that they looked and went, oh, here's someone who's actually doing social action on their return, engaging with this material and spreading the word, doing things. And so I was really honoured to be asked, obviously, to be the chair of the East Midlands Board. So it's about survivor testimony. It's about their right to be heard, and the position I'm in to be able to help them be heard.
So so like you said, it's been in the situation where you've heard someone's testimony of surviving, and I think what makes not Bosnia different or special or anything compared to any of the others, it's the documentaries that we watched as well. It's very much around it's normal behaviour. It's the normal place. It could be where we live. It's mainland Europe. I mean, so from that point of view, it's not somewhere elsewhere on another continent. But it's the fact that the men and the boys were taken away and killed, and then the women. It's not just about surviving and not knowing what happened to your partner, brother, husband, whatever, and and where they are, but you knew they were murdered. It's the fact that you were then systematically targeted in many cases with sexual violence and stuff like that, to then have to deal with that and loss. That makes it quite traumatic, isn't it? I suppose as there's a similarity there with Rwanda, with the use of systematic sexual violence as well, and in some situations that are slightly smaller as well, that wouldn't probably be classed as a genocide, but certainly sort of, ethnic cleansing and the way people have moved on through forced migration, maybe the Rohingya, how people are targeted. It's not just about these big events, is it? And sometimes the Holocaust, I think, is too big for people to get their head around. So when you come back and you speak to the students, what's the starting point? What's the invitation for them to be interested in finding out about this subject?
Well, obviously, our criminology degree includes some kind of core components that are directly relevant. So we have a module in third year on victimology, so very much taking it from the survivor perspective. But we also have international perspectives. So the students who came out to Bosnia, we actually had a trip in February, just before lockdown. We got back in time. Yeah. For them, it was about going on this trip, finding out about what happened in Bosnia, and if they chose to, they could use it for their assignments. Okay. And we'd previously done that with Auschwitz as well. And so this was giving them a different country to focus on, having a different option. So, like I say, particularly well placed to be able to kind of drop in, and I do them as guest lectures. They're not my modules, but so I'm a different face, which helps. Yeah. But then going in and talking to them for quite a lot of the students, still it's in a time frame they understand. Yeah. It's not that long ago. And then for them to be able to see it, I think we took 10 students this time, and it was, hugely transformative for them. But I also use it in open days as a taster session, so people get to see what we really do, what criminologists are really about, and the kinds of subjects that we look at. And so I think for me, the two areas that particularly struck me being in Bosnia was one about the peacekeeping. So you had Mark Charlton on yesterday, obviously, talking about the SDG 16, which my university's, obviously I work with Mark Charlton, is leading on. And I think that's really important about that peace and justice and strong institutions. And so our students are kind of invited to get involved with that. All of the degrees in my division have that as a focus. We are, working towards SDG 16 specifically. So I think that really plays a role in providing the platform for those kinds of conversations to be happening.
Now, I was delighted to be invited to be the media representative on the Remembering Srebrenica East Midland board, so thank you for that. I keep saying thank you, don't I? But that was genuinely meant, because it was a real honour to be asked. And I think one of the things that has probably impacted me the most, obviously I've not been to Srebrenica or even Auschwitz, actually. There's sort of things on that kind of terrible thing to say, a bucket list, but it's one of those things to do that would only enhance the learning that we can do here from the Dot Media Centre. But I think the day that we had the schools visiting en masse, and they came to a session that you invited me to co-host with you, I thought, for me, the most interesting thing out of that, young people looking at what university they were going to, is when we both spoke about, Bosnia, and then we'd spoken about the Holocaust, and we said to them, which one do you think that we should learn about? And they all said, both groups, we should learn about both. And I was actually genuinely shocked about that, because I would have said Bosnia, because, as you said, it's a time frame that they can understand. So it's history that's living for me, or real. And there'd have been those that, well, actually, I don't really want to deal with maybe some of the trauma faced by women. So I'd rather learn about something that was from another time, because then I can believe that it won't happen. But to actually say both, I think were you shocked at that as well? I was quite shocked.
I was, because there was some research out not long before we were running that school session that said that 80% of young people couldn't name another genocide except the Holocaust. And, they study the Holocaust, obviously, as part of World War II history. So they've had some engagement with that as well. So I'm sure they feel more confident in trying to understand some of the nuances around what happened during the Holocaust. So I was a little bit surprised that they went, oh, actually, no, both, because this is, the reasons they gave about it, it's contemporary, it's not just this thing that happened in history. I think that was really pleasing to see, as well as shocking, because I wasn't expecting it. It was also really pleasing to see that.
And what role can you play as both the chair of the board, but also, as you said, an academic with a lot of responsibility for, resources and things like that? Because we kind of sort of thing we talked to Mark Charlton quite a lot about, not just only yesterday, but previously, the role that the university can play in things like secondary schools and primary schools in bringing that additional learning opportunity in addition to the curriculum, if the curriculum is yet at the point where it's teaching those kind of things. But even if it comes in through, say, citizenship or values or whatever it's called this week in the national curriculum, obviously, which isn't running at the moment, but I'm sure it is online. Because I think, what more could we do as a university?
Well, I suppose, as Mark will have said yesterday, we're a university that works very much for the public good. Obviously, the work that Mark specifically does around public engagement is core to our identity at De Montfort University. We do a lot of schools and colleges work anyway. It's part of our brief to engage with young people, firstly, to show them what university is about. But I think it's also an opportunity to get them to reflect on things that they probably wouldn't study as part of their studies or whatever level they're at. I mean, we had sort of the older kind of age group, so I think it was probably easier for us. But they had to think about being community champions back in their own schools. And how would they stand up to hatred and intolerance and bullying and those kinds of things. And I think for me, being chair of the board and also as an academic, it's about social action. My research as well is about taking it beyond teaching. So, I can stand at front of a class, I can talk to 150 students, and that's great. At the end of those 2 hours or whatever, they can leave the room and not have engaged with it at all if they so choose. But why I do what I do, why I'm on the board and why I'm an academic is because I suppose I'm what they'd call an activist criminologist. So I'm very much bothered about how we get young people to be politically engaged, to be activists, to challenge, not just to accept. And I think that's part of my university's identity as well as my own.
And I mean, from a research point of view, what are you going to be moving into next that's relevant to some of the things that you've described?
So some of the work that I've been doing recently has looked at genocide education specifically and the guiding methodologies that are used. So how do, when young people when visitors go to places like Auschwitz or they visit Srebrenica Memorial Museum, what experience do they get? How does that impact on them and does it challenge them? And so we looked at, obviously, Auschwitz first, and the impact that an organised trip with a guide and or translator on occasion, and how that worked in particular rooms being chosen, particular images being shown. So that guiding process as part of the educational tour. Obviously, what we saw with Bosnia was something slightly different in that it's actually survivors who are your tour guides. And so a lot of the work I've been doing recently is obviously writing our journal articles around the student experience, how it changed them or not, as the case may be. I'm starting to now look at the guides and how they use education and what they use it for, how they actually structure guided tours. And I think that's really important because we want to make sure that these aren't just like you were talking earlier about Disneyfication. We don't want it to be that. We want it to have meaning and to actually challenge people. So over the sort of next probably year or so, I'll be building up a number of different pieces of research around why guides do what they do, how that impacts on people, and then how we can apply that in the classroom as well. So looking at this model called transformative education, which argues that you have this disorienting dilemma, which I think visits to sites of human rights abuses are. And what does that mean for you? You know, normally in transformative education, you have an experience and it maybe changes your viewpoint, but it can often be quite temporary. And it's about how do we extend that to being much more of a lifelong change. So when I went to Bosnia, why is it I came back and needed to do stuff? I want to be able to do that with my students. I want to be able to encourage them and support them and give them the skills and confidence to take social action, to do things, to almost cascade the work we're doing on the board, cascade the work they're doing in criminology. You know, a lot of my students are going to be prison officers, police officers, probation officers, people with uniforms and power. And I think one of the biggest things when we think about genocide and ethnic cleansing, that kind of, you know, mass atrocities, is that it is those people with power in uniforms who are often the perpetrators. And so I don't want my students going into the criminal justice system and accepting everything that they are told to do. I want them to, I know we talk a lot, you know, we mark students around critical reflection and things, but I want that to actually mean something. So the research I'm doing is very much about how do we get people to critically reflect? How do we get them to transform in a long-term way? And that, for me, will then help us redevelop our criminology program, because I think that's really important, to have one that isn't just an ology, isn't just a study of crime, but actually moves people to do something. But also to reach out to communities. A lot of the work I'd previously done was around community engagement and preventing hate crime. And I think, you know, genocide, ethnic cleansing is on that spectrum from, you know, if we talk about victimization, unkind and unfair treatment, bullying, low-level hate crime, all the way to mass atrocities, they're all on that spectrum. So if we do research that helps us understand how we can move people to change, then it will have even a small, I think yesterday you used the word about, when you were talking about the documentary media centre, about micro action. And I'm okay with that. If it's a micro change and a micro action, that's fine.
It just needs to be part of something that means that it's going to be ongoing, maybe stick, and you carry on doing it, and it invites you into other things. Okay. I mean, just a couple more points, and then we'll let you get on with your Sunday. Thank you. We were talking a little bit about the role of Facebook and sort of, you know, on WhatsApp to an extent in you know, hate crimes and spreading information, and sort of, you know, the reports that are out about, you know, the role of Facebook in the Rohingya sort of genocide. And obviously, I think it was talking to Paul Riley actually about the hashtag The Troubles, with the research he was doing around the anniversary in Northern Ireland. And really that Instagram is people curating their own remembrance of certain things in certain ways, and hadn't yet been tarnished with that being used for hate crimes and stuff like that. But considering it's one of the three legs of the tripod of the Mark Zuckerberg empire, it's quite interesting, isn't it, that the role that social media plays in that. Are you aware of anyone doing any work around using hashtags, things like that, around, you know, Srebrenica or maybe the broader Bosnia conflict from that time?
I haven't really looked into that. Some of the work I was doing before was about narratives of hate. And we wrote a report a couple of years ago now about language used. I've got a couple of students who were actually looking at the media more generally, so mainstream media as well as social media, but not specifically around hashtags. But we're certainly seeing, obviously, the hashtags, so remembering Srebrenica, for instance, using it as a very positive statement. So the hashtag Every Action Matters, which is our theme for this year, which is the 25th anniversary since the massacre. So I've seen a lot more of it used in terms of positiveness, but I've also seen backlash on Facebook and Twitter. And so some of the research I'd put out, I'd put a call out for participants, and was not prepared for the backlash I got through social media, and had to really reflect on my advert, the way I'd worded things. So I do think social media has quite a significant role to play in causing hurt and hate. In terms of, obviously, Srebrenica Memorial Museum, Remembering Srebrenica as well, both use social media as a platform to share what happened. And I know at the moment, Srebrenica Memorial Centre are actually collating videos and narratives and music as well to share, to actually start an archive for the 25th anniversary. Obviously, because of lockdown, a lot of the work Remembering Srebrenica are doing will now be online, and this is part of it. I did a podcast earlier in the week that will be part of that kind of social media movement.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, when the way I look at, you know, mainstream media, and then you have community media and documentary media down the bottom, they kind of meet at social media because they're both able to use it. So the mainstream media wants to use the reach of it to get its message out, and community media uses it as a way of, because it's a free resource, sort of meeting the mainstream media there. That's what I think was so shocking about the two documentaries that I invited you to watch that are on Amazon, and the links are in the podcast, is the one where the journalist, it wasn't very clear whether he did or he didn't know about the image being taken out, about, you know, the massacre and the site of the massacre and stuff. But it's just that low level, particularly today, World Press Freedom Day, you know, whether he was a willing participant in his image being removed from the report, or whether he felt in danger with his life in order to remove it so it didn't go out from the official. It's that the impact that it has on someone who's capturing something that's factual and truthful and then removing it from the narrative, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. I think when I was watching the two documentaries, the second one with Zoran Petrovic, the one you were just talking about then, Lost Images, really made me start questioning around documentary as truth telling. And I think what I found really interesting in the choice of those is that actually both of them very much focused on crimes being done to and footage of.
Again, you're really using that them and they and others, aren't you?
When I went, it was, so where are the survivors talking about their actual lived experience? We saw lots of images of, so some of the mothers of Srebrenica and Jeppe, who'd lost their husbands and sons and the male members of their family. So we saw a lot of them weeping, taking on a real victim status, which I really struggle with. I'm not a radical feminist, but I do have an issue around the term victim versus survivor, which is why I always use survivor. I did worry about, obviously, the blacked out images and what was missing. And I think one thing that really stood out was the fact that the narrator of that documentary was going, well, we managed to find a copy of a copy of a copy. Yeah. And it was like, wow, so this is a like black market trading in documentary footage. Yeah. And that was just like, I hadn't really thought about it like that before, that there was some kind of, you know, secret way of kind of tapping into real documentary footage. I just assumed that people shot documentaries and then either showed them or didn't, or maybe edited them a bit. You know, I didn't think about people trading in the lost images. So I think that was really interesting. I also think, like I was saying, there was less about the survivor component and more about the investigator and or journalist. So very similar in kind of what they were trying to achieve in terms of finding information for different purposes, really. But with Jean-René Ruiz, I think what really, it's in the first one, so Srebrenica, Autopsy of a Massacre, I mean, there were some really shocking images in there. Some of them I've seen clips of before. I think I saw more within that documentary than I had in some of the clips I've seen, for instance, at Srebrenica Memorial Centre. But I think what was really interesting when he was asked about his coldness, you know, his lack of emotion to the subject matter. And I think it's often difficult with documentary that you've got to be a bit removed from. And he talked about, actually, he used a lot of military language, which was fascinating, sort of conflict language. And he talked about, you know, his weaponry and his camouflage. So he talked about his crime scenes being neutral and that coldness was his camouflage. And I thought that's really interesting, because actually when we took the students to Auschwitz, but also when I went to Bosnia, there's a certain amount of having to distance yourself. And a lot of my students who participated in my research talked about feeling numb or not being able to describe their emotions, because not that they didn't have the words for it, but that they hadn't experienced those emotions before, so it was easier to kind of hold it in, save it for a bit later. And so that was, I think, that was really impactful in the documentary, even though it's that one sentence. And then later when he talks about, his weapons are his investigative skills and his words, I think I felt very much as an academic, I was saying about, I'm in a very privileged position because I get to just talk about this all the time. I can talk to anybody about it. And so my weapons in challenging hate and denial and discrimination very much are my research skills and my words. And so it was interesting to reflect and think, well, is my research almost kind of written documentary because it is documenting? It's that.
I think the important thing is that documentary is what it is to you in how you're using what's around you. I was talking to Paul as well about the documentaries that we'd watched around the secret history of the Troubles, and it was about how someone had found a stash of documents that one department had got rid of, but another department had copied and still had. And so I think about the gaps that we have in popular narratives around particular events that have happened, whether they're genocide or wars or conflicts, or conflicts that have started that we've then discovered 50 years later that person never did that, and that was the justification. Talk about Iraq or Vietnam, that kind of stuff. That really, all of this stuff, whether it's photographs, film, photography, audio, or new media, what I always bang on about, you've just got to find it and maybe look for it in not the usual place, being custodianed by the usual suspects. And then what you'll find is that really it's the person on the ground with the lived experience. John talking earlier about 9/11 being at the bottom of the tower, what you were just saying there about the documentary with a missing piece of footage. It does exist. It's whether we can all embrace those investigative journalism skills, if you like, to put the effort in to find it, isn't it? And bring that narrative. I would say one of your main weapons is your enthusiasm, Kim, but there we go.
Thanks for that, John.
Cool, excellent. So just a quick minute, we're at 2:00, so just wrap us up quickly. Tell us what we're going to be doing for the remembrance in July, the 25th anniversary. Have you got any thoughts?
So it's all online, obviously. We've got some students who are writing some poetry. So those who came out to Bosnia with me are going to be writing some poetry, doing some artwork, very similar to the work of Robert McNeil, one of my good friends who's also at Remembering Srebrenica, but in Scotland. So very much about different forms of media that we can use to communicate. So poetry, artwork, using the Srebrenica flower as well, as a way to pledge to do certain things. So even if it's, have a conversation online. So I know some people had put some photos when we were out in Bosnia on Instagram and Twitter and things, and then that had triggered conversations. And so whilst we were there, they were also, starting that process of transforming and kind of engaging with people about the subject of Bosnia. So people can do lots of different things. You can light a candle, you can hold a minute silence. So it doesn't have to be something big. It can be, go and find out, go onto Remembering Srebrenica's website and find out about what it is that they do and why.
And these are those micro actions that we talk about all the time, isn't it? Because you're just growing as a person by understanding a little bit more, and then a degree of empathy might develop inside you that you're unaware of, but it's developing all into that, and that's where your mindset gets changed about those people or them or they, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the worrying thing right now is the narratives that we've seen, obviously, because we're in lockdown, and people are talking about, well, it's Chinese people's fault, it's Muslims' fault. There seems to be a lot of this kind of blame narrative going on at the moment, and so actually one of the things that's really important about what Remembering Srebrenica does is about challenging hatred. It's trying to build stronger communities. Last year's theme was bridging the divide, and I think actually because of lockdown and because of the hate narratives that are building because of that, that actually one of the things we're all going to have to do, and I'd urge everybody to do that, is to bridge those divides, to find out about different communities, to not assume, that the narratives you're hearing about blame are true, and almost becoming the investigative journalist yourself. Go out and find out information, fact check it.
I love it. Become a citizen's investigative journalist. We've started a new trend. There we go.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, cheers, John.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
And you.
Thanks, Kim.
All right, bye.